All right, so good afternoon or good evening, everybody. My name is Jesse, and I'm going to be the host for today's very special program, a partnership between my organization, Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, who is providing the inspiration for today's talk, which is very, very exciting. We're welcoming in folks from across many, many time zones today, so welcome into groups in Alaska, Nevada, already in the chat, and beyond. Wherever you're joining from across the U.S., Canada, or internationally, we'd love to hear where you're from, so do let me know in the chat bar on the side. So there are very few natural places on this planet that achieve iconic status, where everybody knows their name. The Great Barrier Reef, the Serengeti, the Amazon rainforest. And in the last 5 years, there's been a name added to that list, a name that I didn't know when I was a kid, but now is something that I cherish as being part of not only the world's natural repository of really incredible wilderness spaces, but of North America's, where I live. And that is the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. It even has the acronym ANWR. And today we are having the immense pleasure and privilege of getting to chat with Roger Kaye. He is the Arctic Refuge Wilderness Specialist, and he is going to chart the 7-year journey to found the refuge to begin with and celebrate its 60th anniversary today as we get to highlight its creation, why it's such a special place, and what's being done to protect it. Roger is the perfect guide for this journey. He has done it all in his 41-year career with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. He has written a book on the Arctic, wintered on a trapline, flown, hunted, and hiked all over Alaska. Again, one of the most amazing places on this planet, and an even smaller slice of that, which is just a little slice of heaven. So I'm very excited to introduce Roger to you guys today. When we dive in with this presentation, we are going to have some interactive elements as well. So if you are in the chat bar and you'd like to answer some poll questions really rapidly in the chat as we go through, I'll be monitoring that to be able to relay your answers to Roger. With that said and all the housekeeping done, I cannot wait to dive in. Roger, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate you taking the time, and I'm excited, as our audience is, to dive in on this journey with you. So, Roger, take us away.
Okay, well, thank you, and thanks for tuning in, everyone. We're going to begin here with a story of the origin and the purposes of the Arctic Refuge, and the ideas and the idealism of those who led the 7-year, very hard-fought campaign to establish it. And then we'll end with a question of what future for this landscape in this emerging era of the Anthropocene. Now, as Jeff warned you, maybe we'll have 3 quizzes during the program, and at the end we'll have a test. So you'll want to pay attention. Well, to begin, the Arctic Refuge is huge. It's the size of South Carolina. It's a 19.5 million acre expanse of wildness and ecological wholeness, making up pretty much the whole northeast corner of Alaska. So the story of the origin of the Arctic Refuge begins in 1952 here at the high mountain Norwalk Lakes with 2 National Park Service planners who were hoping to establish an ultimate national park wilderness. One was George Collins. He was chief planner for the National Park Service. He was aptly described by his agency as their dreamer of the biggest dreams. And his partner on this effort was Lowell Sumner, a visionary and pioneering ecologist. Now, the way they first saw this area and interpreted the value of what they saw was greatly influenced by one of their friends who had since died. Bob Marshall, whose writings about exploring the Brooks Range and whose audacious 1938 proposal for a permanent wilderness frontier across northern Alaska had preconditioned conservationists to imagine landscape preservation in Alaska on a vast, ecosystem-wide scale. And so too, Marshall's pioneering use of the new science of psychology to explore the wilderness experience and the wilderness concept really expanded the range of values that Collins and Sumner were able to see in this landscape. Next summer, while camped below this spire, Collins and Sumner committed themselves to protecting this area, and they began drafting an article extolling its wilderness values. Well, Northeast Arctic, the last great wilderness, was their article that appeared in the Sierra Club magazine, and this is the article that initiated that very hard-fought 7-year campaign to preserve what became the Arctic National Wildlife Range in 1960, which was later expanded and redesignated as the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge in 1980. Although for practical purposes, the terms range and refuge refer to the same thing. So Collins and Sumner were soon joined by Olaus and Marty Murray, who took over leadership of the campaign in 1954. Now, Olaus had been a preeminent field biologist in Alaska since the 1920s, expert in the area, and he quit the Fish and Wildlife Service to head the Wildness Society. He was now its executive director. And he and his wife, Marty, are shown here along the Sinjuk River during their 1956 summer-long exploration of the area. And so these four were soon joined by many of the era's most prominent conservationists. And this is a virtual who's who listing of the most important conservation leaders of the 1950s. Now, many of these were pioneers of the emerging ecological thinking, and they were also leaders of the growing wilderness movement, including Howard Zahniser, who was the author of the Wilderness Act and who couldn't join the expedition because he was busy in Washington at the time drafting up the first version of what became the Wilderness Act. And so in this regard, it's important to remember that the campaign to establish a protected wilderness area in northeast Alaska was concurrent with a larger effort to enact what would become the Wilderness Act. In fact, the people who were leading the effort to pass the Wilderness Act were the same people who at the same time were using the same arguments to preserve what's now the Arctic Refuge. We should keep in mind that, both these efforts occurred in the larger context of the post-World War II transformation of America. The 1950s brought us the world's highest standard of living and rate of consumption, and also an unprecedented rate of environmental degradation. And so the rapid loss of natural areas, the destructive logging, mining, and agricultural practices, the spread of pollution and pesticides, and the awful power and the fallout of the atomic bomb, these were among the many swift changes that awoke many people to a new order of environmental threat. And it led some people, like the Murrays, to wonder if we might even be changing the planet. However, Alaska's political leaders were not among them. All of Alaska's political leaders, without exception, strongly opposed this Arctic proposal, this proposal for Alaska Great Wilderness. They didn't want the march of progress restrained, and they were threatened by what Senator Greening here referred to as the, quote, theoretical conceptions of the proponents of this area, this last great wilderness. And so more on those conceptions later. I'll just say now, though, that as political opposition to a wilderness park increased, some apparent compromise was necessary, and the proponents decided to advocate for a less restrictive wildlife range. However, Alaska's Senator Bob Bartlett, who became the most powerful opponent of the proposed refuge, he wasn't among those who were fooled. He knew that opponents continued to envision this as some kind of a huge archetypal wilderness area. So the question then is, what did this wilderness concept mean to the proponents of this area? What resources were important to them, and what, quote, theoretical conceptions motivated those who fought to preserve this landscape? Well, based on interviews and thousands of pages of articles and congressional testimony that the campaign generated, I found that this wilderness represented an interwoven set of both tangible and intangible values. And they can be summarized as wildlife, and especially in an ecological context, scientific value here, a recreational value to this landscape, a cultural heritage value, a bequest value, and related to these was an ulterior motive of the founders of this refuge, a more far-reaching symbolic value. So with that background, let's take a look at the range of values that underpinned the struggle to establish Alaska Great Wilderness here, and that actually continue in the Arctic Refuge today. Now, of course, the area was featured as a sanctuary for wildlife. Campaign leaders spoke to the interrelatedness and the equal value of all life forms here. And that included the little unnoticed creatures as well as the often disliked predators. So it wasn't just the big and charismatic species that were favored for hunting or viewing that had been the basis for establishing previous wildlife refuges. It was really the animal's wild context that was emphasized by the founders, knowing that their natural behavior, their interactions, and their ecological role would continue here. And so wildness then was a word that just resonated through the campaign writings and the advocacy for this place. And what they mean by wildness, well, it was a freedom of the area's ecological and evolutionary processes. And the campaign leaders used evocative prose, they used photographs, and they used art, like this drawing by George Collins, to establish the caribou as the symbolic representation of this idea of a landscape and its life forms that are free. But even more than the caribou, the early writings portrayed the wolf as the main carrier of this ideological significance of a place that's free of the human intent to alter, control, or subjugate nature for our purposes. And I should note that it was only after I started doing a content analysis, seriously looking at the founders' writings and their testimonies, that I began to notice how often they referenced symbolism in their work to establish this area. In this statement, Lowell Sumner provided what I think is the most succinct encapsulation of the founders' expansive thinking and their hope for this area. So now is the time for our first quiz. And remember, it's a one-word answer only. The question is, what is Sumner referring to here? In fact, what one word is he avoiding using?
So I've given our folks on YouTube and Facebook a chance to answer. If you guys want to throw your hat in the ring and see what you guys think, go for it on either one, and I'll check for answers. While we're waiting for that, Roger, I'll note we've got people tuning in from California, Arizona, Alaska, Nevada, Texas, so all over the U.S., which is really exciting.
Oh, good.
All right, don't be shy, everybody. If you want to chime in, wilderness we have as an answer. Anyone else have a thought? Catherine's asking if you could repeat the question for us, Roger.
Okay, sure. Question is, what is Lowell Sumner referring to here in this quote? It's the same thing, it's the same word that he's actually avoiding.
All right, we'll give him a few more seconds. So far, wilderness going once, going twice. That may be it, Roger. If people chime in after this, I'll bring it up in banners on the screen that you'll be able to see. But right now, no one's chiming in outside of that.
Okay, well, I'll tell you what. I'll give you the answer then. The answer is evolution. Evolution, what the founders referred to as the scientific story of creation. Now, interesting thing is, while Olaus Murie referenced evolution all the time, Lowell Sumner worked for the Park Service. He worked for the government. And because evolution was a bit heretical at that period in our history, he wasn't able to use it. And so he's describing it here. But actually, the Arctic Refuge, it's very interesting, is probably the first American conservation unit for which maintaining evolutionary processes was a motivation for its establishment. It wasn't the main one, but it was a very significant one to the founders. So wildness is then ultimately unfettered evolution. And wildness is interesting because it's at once two things. First, it's an objective condition of a landscape. That is, it's where the ecological and evolutionary processes continue free of human intent. But there's also an interrelational dimension to wildness. The fact that we have chosen not to intervene or interfere with these processes makes wildness a distinctive human-nature relationship. a relationship of respect for and deference to these processes. So the hope here was that whole ecosystems and their large-scale processes would remain wild. The idea that this place would preserve a continuum of intact, fully functioning ecosystems that were large enough to be biologically self-sufficient. That's what led campaign leaders to proclaim this area to be a place of preeminent scientific value. It's interesting, it wasn't just scientists who advocated for this place as becoming a scientific laboratory. It was regular folks like this woman, Virginia Wood, who actually brought me to Alaska in the early 1970s. But her hope and people's hope was that this area would become a living museum of how nature functions when we leave it alone. And so wilderness here was seen to serve human needs that a modern, increasingly urban, commodity-driven culture was leaving unmet. Now, Sandy Jameson here is one of the current visitors to Arctic Refuge, and he really knows the experience that the founders wanted to be available here. Now, he's a hunter, and he said he could hunt in other areas of the state that have more game. And this is a transcendent spiritual type of experience that, many people find here, although few are able or willing to articulate it like Sandy does. But I'll just say this is just one component of another prominent purpose for establishing the Arctic Refuge, and that is recreation. Although I think that word is really a wholly insufficient term for the kind of experience that was intended to be available here. So let's take a few minutes and look at the recreational experience and consider the attributes of this landscape that are conducive to it, some of which are tangible and some that are not. Now, like many people today, George Schaller, who was with the Muries in that summer of 1956, he found this to be a place of solitude and introspection, self-reflection, and restoration. And contributing to these type of benefits is the near absence of the reminders of the outside world. That enables a trip here to become two things, both a means of getting from one place to another and the process of getting from one way of thinking to another. It's called a flow experience. And it's called that because, after a few days here, when you're free of the clock and free of the calendar and pressure to conform, a person feels as if they're just being carried away by the flow. And for most people, it takes a few days, though, for the outside world to kind of loosen its grasp on their mind. But this was also to be an adventuring ground. This was to be the antithesis of the commercial and convenience-oriented tourism that national parks were promoting at the time. This was to be a place for challenge and self-reliance and hardships and even risk that, sometimes is not enjoyed at the time, but you look back on them as defining elements of the trip. And it reminds us that an experience in this place is more than just the 1 or 2 or maybe 3 weeks you spend on site. It's also in the story that you take home that becomes part of who you are. And so there are a number of potential challenges and sometimes risks in a trip to the Arctic Refuge, like crossing rivers or floating rapids like this. And you need to be alert for dangers that are unique to the Arctic, like being swept under overflow ice. And then there are the bears. They remind you of your littleness and that you don't dominate this environment. In fact, just their unseen presence heightens your attention. And as Miri said, you're not just observing this landscape, you're participating in it. So the refuge founders were concerned that post-war changes were resulting in fewer opportunities for adventurous and challenging type of experiences, the kind of things that Bob Marshall had extolled. And Sportsman's Group, hunters, supported the Arctic proposal because it would perpetuate opportunities for primitive and adventurous type hunting. And it's what Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas, who visited here during that 1956 expedition, what he summarized as the call to adventure. And so that leads us to quiz 2. And here is the question. Again, a one-word answer. There can be no adventure without the element of what? Well, one word best describes the attribute that the agency needs to protect for this area to continue being the adventuring ground the founders hoped.
All right, so one-word answer, folks, Facebook and YouTube. I had a thought in my mind, and then you added a sentence, Roger, and threw me off, and so my word is probably wrong. But for anyone on Facebook or YouTube,
throw it out, give it a try.
Well, I was going to say surprise at the beginning there, because sort of that novelty is something that really speaks to me when I get to go to places. Unpredictability just came in the chat as well. And anyone else? We've got Chelsea in Texas who wants you to know that she feels like she needs the trip and is slightly hypnotized by all your amazing photos. Unknown, unpredictability, surprise, sensing a theme here. Yeah, so there we go. Risk is our other one. Great answers, guys. So Roger, what is it? Lay it on us.
Okay, well, gee whiz, this group is really good. Better than most, actually. It's actually not risk. Risk is often an important component, but it isn't necessary. But what the answer is, what it was, is the unknown. And I guess a couple of people got it right, so that's great. Some sense of unknown. It could be the unknown of what lies ahead or perhaps within. Can I do it? Can I find my own way? And in fact, there are many unknowns in a trip to this landscape. For one is the weather, but another is water level, for example. And this couple might have come expecting a leisurely float down this river or maybe exciting ride through the rapids. But the water level was low when they got here, and instead, for miles and miles, their experience was a drag. And the defining element of their trip was really endurance. And so this intrigue of what lies around the next bend or over the horizon is part of the sense of mystery. It's that elusive but compelling aura that there's something beyond, something that you have to search out yourself here. And so today, in the entire Arctic Refuge, the size of North Carolina, there are no what they call recreational improvements anywhere. There's no campgrounds, no trails, no signs pointing the way anywhere in the Arctic Refuge. And the reason why? Because for every management action that would make the trip less uncertain, would reduce the uncertainty, or make your experience more predictable, or more convenient, or even more safe, something of the original purpose of this place would be lost. So this is what we advise visitors who come to this place. And it's part of what makes your experience, your connection here so authentic. So for Fish and Wildlife Service, our message is do come to the Arctic Refuge, but come prepared physically and mentally. And come as a guest of this place. Come willing to yield your uses, your conveniences to its presence. This place was promoted and recognized as a place of aesthetic value, very prominent in the the establishment of the area. And the word aesthetic was used more than scenic, probably because of Aldo Leopold's influence. It was his notion that the aesthetic effect combines what's seen in the landscape with what's known about it. And part of the aesthetic effect derived from the area's growing ideological significance. And you know, what Olaus was referring to here in this quote was that this place, as a campaign went on and people started learning about the opportunity to preserve it and what was at risk here, it came to represent the ideas and the ideals embodied in this wilderness concept. And these were the ideals that these same people were trying to enshrine in a federal law that eventually became the Wilderness Act. So among these ideas was this notion that wilderness can be a medium for opening people to something within themselves that seeks connection or relatedness to something beyond themselves. And that's why Justice Douglas wrote this pronouncement. This was to be a sacred place, sacred for what it is, as well as for what it was to be set apart from. This area would be set apart from that, utilitarian commodity orientation that rules a major part of our lives. And this is very interesting, very much in contrast to the parks are for people or this is your park type of slogans at the time. This was the normal Park Service parlance for promoting their parks. The message here among people promoting this area was very different. The message was, this place isn't here to serve you, it's here for itself. Coming to accept that the place isn't here to serve visitors, but it's here for itself, is very humbling. But the founders knew that it's only through humility, that sense of being a small part of something larger, something more important, deeper benefits of the wilderness experience emerge. And just paramount in the early writings of this place was the idea that the benefits of wilderness should be timeless. This place was intended to be a bequest to the future. And over in campaign writings, we see the founders using words like posterity, legacy, and future generations. Experiences like my daughters had, just discovering wolf tracks in the mud. It was a really simple joy compared to the basketball and TV and computer games that shaped and bound their world back in Fairbanks. But it was really so much more of a powerful experience, stimulating their imagination and really opening them to nature and perhaps the real nature within themselves. So that leads us to our third and final quiz for the day, quiz 3. Again, it's going to be a one-word answer, and the question is this. As a bequest to the future, this had to be a place of what? What single word do you think best summarizes what this place would represent to future generations?
So again, for everyone on Facebook and YouTube, if you guys want to chime in with your answers, you were so good last time. I think we gave them an ego boost, Roger, when they got the right answer last time. So I think that they're riding high off that still, and they're ready for this one. For me, while we're waiting for the answers to pour in the chat, wonder is the word that jumps to mind. So certainly my experience has been in national parks and places where I've got the chance to experience not quite this level of wilderness, but something like it is just wonder or magic. In the
well, that's I'm sorry, Jess, but you're far off on this one.
Damn, well, for anyone who was going to copy me in the chat, don't.
Olaus Miri is giving you a little hint here, folks.
Yeah, we got Wildness that just came in. I'll give everyone a few more seconds, and we'll dive back in. Wildness is good. All right. Well, wildness, wilderness untouched. There we go. So it's all the same theme. We've got people complaining that it's hard now, Roger. You're scaring them off. But
No. Okay, anything else?
timelessness just came in, which I like as a term, even if it's wrong. It's a good pick.
Yeah,
But
that's
I
nice.
think that's our gang of answers.
Okay, well, I'll tell you what. These are all components, but they're not what the founders really had in mind here. And you kind of go back to the context of this, what was happening in the 1950s. Remember, at that time, there was no restraint. There was no Clean Water Act, no Wilderness Act. There was no Clean Air Act. There was no Endangered Species Act. There was very little restraint on what happened to the natural environment. And so what it really was intended to be a place of restraint. And people wonder, well, why restraint? Well, I tell you, the reason is the Arctic Refuge and the Wilderness Act, too, were really about three main things. The first is preserving the natural condition of the landscape and the experience you could find here. The second one was maintaining those natural processes of wildness. But the third, this place in wilderness was also intended to be about us, about exercising that better part of us, willing to restrain ourselves. The Arctic Refuge, every wilderness really, is an encouraging demonstration and a reminder of our capacity to restrain our immediate interests, uses, and profits. And so the thought of these founders was this, that we as a people are enlarged when we set places apart, not just for what benefits or uses they can provide for us, but how they enable us to see ourselves as a part of the larger community of life, on the larger scheme of things. And that really was a grounding of the American wilderness movement, and not coincidentally, it's a universal grounding of all spiritual traditions. So, among other things, wilderness is where we restrain technology. But it's important to note that it's not just because of the physical impacts that technology might cause. That they might leave a scar or squish plants or cause a disturbance. That wasn't the sole concern of the refuge founders or the framers of the Wilderness Act. They also realized that every technology expresses a set of values. It has a worldview built into it. Its use and even its presence alters one's experience of and relationship to the landscape. And so it's good to remember that sometimes we forego technology for no reason other than as a gesture of respect for what wilderness represents. And that's something that Marty Murray often spoke to. I'll mention that after doing this research on the history of this place for a while, I began to notice how often the refuge founders placed their advocacy for this area in the larger context of the world, the earth, and the planet. I didn't realize the significance of this larger perspective until when I was in the library, the archives at the University of Alaska. I found a yellowed letter deep in Senator Bartlett's collection, the archives. Now, this was a letter from Olaf Smeary. It was a desperate letter that Olaf had sent to the senator in late 1959. Now, Senator Bartlett was the most powerful, strident opponent of the proposal to preserve this area. And although a refuge bill had passed the House of Representatives, Bartlett kept it locked up in his Senate committee. So time was running out, and with little to lose, Olaf disclosed that ulterior motive of the campaign leaders. And he said in this letter, he says, this question of whether or not we should preserve this landscape is bigger than a lot of people have assumed. It involves a real problem of what the human species is to do with this earth. So the real problem, the larger issue to the Muries, was human-Earth relations. It was about establishing a place where we draw the line on our unsustainable behavior toward this finite and shared planet. Well, the senator wasn't persuaded, and he blocked the Senate vote on the refuge bill, and so legislative efforts to establish what became the Arctic Refuge failed. And so, responding to very strong public pressure, Secretary of Interior Seaton established the Arctic Range through an executive order. In that order he issued gave the refuge this official purpose, for the purpose of preserving unique wildlife, wilderness, and recreational values. Now, never before had a wildlife refuge been established to preserve values. And so immediately the Arctic Refuge became quite an anomaly for the Fish and Wildlife Service, and in many ways it still is. Well, to summarize now the legacy of the Arctic campaign, from its origin in Bob Marshall's wild vision for a permanent wilderness frontier in northern Alaska, the Arctic campaign did succeed in establishing the nation's first truly vast ecosystem scale conservation unit. It's one that exemplified the natural qualities that the Muries and Sonneneiser and these others sought to protect in the Wilderness Act. But there's more to the legacy. This place embodied their more encompassing hope for the wilderness concept, hoping that it might stimulate Americans to think beyond conservation of resources to protection of whole ecosystems. And beyond that, even to rethink their relationship to the larger biosphere that we jointly inhabit. So, as intended, the Arctic Refuge has become a symbol. Well, the founders of the Arctic Refuge were visionaries for sure. I mean, they were pioneers in this emerging ecological evolutionary thinking. But we need to remember that they lived in the context of 1950s conditions and 1950s understandings of global scale, climate change, anthropogenic change. And at that time, there was virtually no understanding of that. The best thinking at their time was, well, you draw a line around the area, you make it a refuge wilderness, you keep out developments and inappropriate types and levels of public use. Just leave it alone, and it will always be natural. It'll always be like it has been. And although they did place their preservation efforts in this place in the larger context of the Earth and the globe and the planet, they couldn't have foreseen the Anthropocene. They couldn't have seen the Anthropocene, this emerging era of Earth's history wherein human activities are becoming a dominant, disturbing, and in fact, destabilizing force on the entire Earth system. And today, scientific projections and models predict that substantial, although largely unknown, changes to the entire planet. And this is especially true for the landscapes and the resources of the Arctic, and Alaska is already seeing that. So, what does this mean for the future of the Arctic Refuge? Well, in 2015, refuge scientists did what's called a meta-analysis of studies that projected anthropogenic or human-caused ecological change in the Arctic. They looked at all the studies that were applicable to the future of the Arctic Refuge. And here is a summary of what they learned, and you can just read it. Well, if you believe in best science, this is the future of the Arctic Refuge. And really, it's happening already. So, widely regarded as the nation's preeminent archetypal natural area, the exemplar of naturalness, the Arctic Refuge will no longer be natural by the next century of the Anthropocene, the year 2100. At least it won't be natural as the word natural has been traditionally defined or understood. That is, when a place is not shaped by or substantially impacted by human activities. This notion of what's natural as separate from what's human affected is becoming just increasingly problematic, and humans and nature are becoming more inseparably intertwined and entangled in a hybrid world. And so more and more, some people are saying, well, let go of the idea of naturalness as a primary conservation goal. Replace this old concept of natural, nature, with more scientific goals like maintaining ecological integrity or biodiversity. And that makes sense from just a scientific perspective. But especially when you consider Arctic Refuge's history, it's very clear that nature is more than an objective ecological or baseline condition. Nature also has aesthetic and psychological and spiritual and symbolic dimensions. And these are really prominent in people's experience and their valuation and their motivation for protecting this landscape. So rather than abandon what's natural or naturalness as a conservation goal, perhaps we could redefine the concept to mean something like this. Natural would be free of intentional human alterations, developments, mechanisms, and such artifacts, regardless of the degree to which its composition, its ecology has changed in response to human-caused anthropogenic global scale factors. And so, looking toward the future, I think one question we should address is this: whether we should keep trying to maintain naturalness as a conservation goal, and if we do, how should we redefine or reinterpret nature for this post-natural world that we're entering? So that's one question. But the much bigger, more critical question we're going to face is this: what should we do, or what might we do, to resist change to our favorite species or the current conditions? What might we do here to prevent their loss, or maybe to restore them once they've changed? Well, what could we do? Well, we could employ what's called ecological interventions, or manipulations or restoration efforts, such as these tools that are widely used and employed in the lower 48. And I'm just going to give you some examples here. One is manipulating the hydrological system or the water system through water impoundments, dikes, dams, and guzzlers. In the middle picture there, you see a guzzler. They store water for wildlife when drought conditions occur. And this is actually commonly done in lower 48 refuges, and it does very successfully maintain or increase the number of target species like ducks and geese, although it, of course, substantially changes the ecosystem. And actually, previous management at the Arctic Refuge did once seriously discuss the possibility of sometime damming the refuge's Jago River to provide water for wildlife when the river's headwater glacier melts away, as is predicted to happen. Other examples, what might happen in terms of interventions: planting greenhouse-raised, disease-resistant, warm temperature adapted plants, maybe to replace those that are no longer viable or living in changing conditions. Another example is using prescribed fire or fire suppression, eradicating invasive plants through the use of herbicides or pulling. And then there's that god-awful scary genetic engineering or biocontrol agents that can be used and has been used in lower 48 to help species adapt and to control pathogens. And these are just some. There are many other types of potential interventions that are used elsewhere to try to prevent change, resist change, keep current conditions. And I'll just say that if interventions are in the future of the Arctic Refuge, I sure hope proponents carefully consider their potential unintended consequences, including the potential for intervention to impede the resources or the system's eventual adaptation to the new conditions. And at least you think that ecological inventions are far away in terms of time or distance. Don't have to worry about it here, not now. Consider what's called the Ice 9/11 project. It's an experiment near Barrow, Alaska, and it's just down the coast, 100 miles or so from the Arctic Refuge. And it's where researchers from Stanford University covered 4 acres of ice with sunlight reflecting particles that they engineered made of this glass-based silica material. They put it on the ice in the hope, an experiment to see if it has the potential to save the ice and polar bear habitat. It's another example of the kind of intervention that may be proposed here that we'll need to consider. But we need to remember that any intervention, however important the resources or the uses it seeks to perpetuate, would diminish the most defining quality of this wilderness, and that is its wild. What is wildness? Well, based on the intent of Howard Zahniser, who wrote the Wilderness Act, and others who worked with him, wildness can be defined as this quality. It's the condition or state of a landscape characterized by its freedom from the human intent to alter, control, or manipulate its components or ecological and evolutionary processes. And so it's a state wherein those processes of an area's genesis are allowed to shape its future when free from human purpose, human utility, design, or subjugation. And I'll just point out one phrase here that people sometimes overlook in terms of wildness. It is the freedom from human intent. It's not freedom from human effect. That's what naturalness is, or what it's supposed to be. It's free from human intent. And so we should clarify what wildness is not then. Wildness is not a synonym for pristine or virgin. Wildness is not the absence of all human effect. In fact, wildness can persist in environments that have been altered or continue to be influenced by external human factors like climate change, as long as we refrain from interfering with nature's autonomous response. And we should remember the root word of wild or wilderness or wildness is will, referring to it being self-willed and not subject to our will. So I will say that the Arctic Refuge can't be natural in the traditional notion of it in the future. It won't be. The Arctic Refuge can be and can always remain wild if we are willing. If we're willing to forego interventions and restoration efforts in the hope of perpetuating, for example, our favorite species in environments becoming less suited to them. And if, for example, we're willing to identify or to designate the Arctic Refuge as what's called a hands-off non-intervention area, within which the ecological system would be allowed to adapt and evolve as it will, however it will. And we would, for example, accept that the populations of some of our preferred species might decline or be replaced. Changes then in the composition, the structure, the wildlife of the area would not be resisted, but would become just part of what eventually might become a novel ecosystem. So to conclude now, the great hope of the Arctic campaign was to leave this portion of our planet alone, for it to remain natural, to remain as it always had been. But now we know that it won't be. It can't be. But the founder's expression that most speaks to me now is the very short and simple statement that Marty Murray concluded her Senate hearing testimony with. This was her Senate testimony on the Senate Bill 1899 to establish the Arctic Wildlife Range. And I think now is the time to look ahead, to the next century of the Anthropocene, the year 2100. And you know, it's not that far out, really, just 2.5 generations from now. And we should be thinking now about many things, and especially that crucial question, should we intervene here to maintain or try to maintain the species or conditions here that we most like? Or should we just let the area adapt and evolve as it will? Remain wild. And you know, it's a wicked question, partly because while we know change is certain, we really don't know just what it will be. And that's called the Anthropocene dilemma. Change is certain, but we don't know just what it will be. But we do know from our 50-year history of wilderness management in this country that one well-intended decision to intervene leads to another. It's a decision creep, a slippery slope of incremental but cumulative changes that, without a conscious, forward-looking decision, an area becomes more managed and less wild. So to conclude then, finally, the main decision I see facing us is this. Will we be willing to let go of current or natural conditions, that is, you know, the products of evolutionary creativity at our point in time, to perpetuate that creative evolutionary process itself, wildness? So now is that time for a long look ahead. And with that, your final exam question is, what do you think?
Roger, that is a beautiful place to end, and thank you very much for sharing all this with us today. We've got about 10 minutes for questions for anyone who wants to share things, and I will provide some links where people can learn more and share more questions and find out more about the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge and beyond at the end of the broadcast. But if Roger, if you'd like to come out of screen share and join us again, we can have a bit of a conversation. You can see me again, so take your time with that, no hurry at all. What I'm going to do is bring up a question that we had shared from some of the classmates that are set to watch tomorrow. They couldn't make it late tonight, but they're going to tune into the YouTube broadcast later, so I want to share some questions on their behalf. We have a few here that are really, really good. So can we take the lessons from the creation of this refuge and apply them to create other refuges? Has that already been done? I mean, you mentioned there's the 60-year-long history of this and all this backdrop that you got a chance to share with us today. Are we taking these lessons and applying them to creating new places? Have we done that already, or is that coming down the pipeline?
Well, to some degree, it's done in most all wilderness areas, but I will say that the Arctic Refuge is very unique, both in its origin and its purposes and the very unique set of founders that we had. But nevertheless, I think all wilderness areas, to some degree, do have this general approach. Although very few so far have really thought about the critical question of head, and that is, how do we respond to the inevitable change of the Anthropocene?
Yep. And I think our certainly the comments on YouTube indicate people are starting to think about those sort of things, which is fantastic. So if people do have any questions, please do share them. I'll try and take as many as I can over the next few minutes. One thing that you mentioned early on in the broadcast that really spoke to me, and I love that you have an example of this over your shoulder. Are there symbols and artwork that speak most to you about the landscape and region? You shared all these beautiful pictures, but artistry in sort of inspiring people to take action has been a big thing that I've noticed in programs on refuges and natural areas around the world. Is there anything for you personally that really touches you?
Oh yeah, you know, it's interesting that in the 50s, art in particular, photography, but art especially, was very influential. Artists illustrated these philosophical, these ideas, and so people could visually kind of get a sense of what they were talking about here. This final picture with the Muries was a real classic work of art done by Rusty Herlin, but there are many, many other pieces of art that have been inspired by the Arctic Refuge. And in fact, if you Google artists of the Arctic Refuge, you can see there's quite a group of artists that have come to the refuge over the years to try to convey its different values and resources visually.
Fantastic. I'm just typing into a banner that we can bring in to showcase that for people. So check out Artists of the Arctic Refuge to see some of those images. I know I will when we're done the broadcast today. So you talked about some of the changes, of course, that are happening in the refuge and in Alaska and generally and beyond, sort of on a broad scale take. But for you personally, you've had this 40-year career in Alaska, in the region. Are there things that you've seen change personally over that time that you can share with us?
Oh, yeah. Well, I've seen many of these things. Been hanging out at the refuge for 40 years now, almost. I was going to say one thing that, for 29 years, I was a pilot for the Arctic Refuge here. And every year, many times I'd fly over the crest of the Brooks Range to the coastal plain. And, when you were that high over the crest of the mountains, you'd always see the pack ice. For years, I saw it. And then you saw it less often or later in the season. And the last few years I've flown there, you cross over the Brooks Range and you can't even see the ice. It is retreated so far. And of course, that's the habitat for polar bears and many other species as well. I've watched the glaciers, retreat and melt away. And there are other changes too, more subtle than a non-trained observer sees.
Yeah. It's something certainly in exploring by the seat of your pants. In our broadcast, we've featured Glacier National Park in Montana, and they have these historical photographs from the exact same location where you can see the glaciers radically in a different spot than they were. Kilimanjaro is another example of this. So this is one of the most salient, sort of powerful images of this change over the last few years in the warming planet. So it's fascinating to hear from someone who's had that experience and been able to see that, especially from that unique perspective up in the air, which is very, very neat. I think that this question from Catherine, who I know you know well, is a great place to end us off today, which is, do you think the question of whether or not to intervene in the Arctic Refuge applies to the rest of the world in the Anthropocene or just to the wildest places? Is this something that is unique to refuges like what we're talking about or everywhere?
I think it's going to be everywhere. I think in many areas, not just conservation units, but we'll have to decide where do we wish to intervene and where can we practicably do so, and which areas should we just accept change, stand back and watch and learn from change. But you look at the projections of the scientific community, it's inevitable that there'll be major changes, and we will never have the resources to try to resist in all the places.
That is a beautiful question, Catherine, and a fantastic answer, Roger. I'm again, it's been such a privilege to get the chance to chat with you today and to hear from someone who's had such a wide array of experiences in the region and such a deep historical background of knowledge. So thank you so much for this. What I want to stress for people at home, if you want to learn more, Roger's written a fantastic book, Last Great Wilderness. So you can check that out below, and it's available all over the place. So lots of places to read that, whether that's buying it or at your public library. And then if you want to learn more about the Arctic Refuge as spoken by the people who facilitate it, the Fish and Wildlife Service, the website fws.gov/refuge/Arctic will take you there. So lots of ways to learn more. Again, the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge is one of these iconic wild places on this planet now, and so there's a bevy of photography, art that we talked about earlier, all these ways of learning and cherishing this really, really unique and special place. Roger, is there any last message you'd like to leave us with before we wrap up for the day?
Nope. Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Thank you guys so much. Again, viewers from all over the United States and beyond, such a pleasure having you. Looking forward to many more people checking this out over the days to come. And for now, I'll just say a big thank you again to Roger for